right? A question first before I tell you anything. What age were you told Mary was when she had Jesus? Go ahead. Say it in your mind. You know the answer. You were taught it. You heard it from a pulpit, or read it in a children's Bible, or simply absorbed it the way you absorb the colors of a familiar room. 14. Pure. Innocent. A girl, really. Almost impossibly young, which was part of the point, wasn't it? The innocence required for the nativity to mean what it was supposed to mean. It is remarkable, when you think about it, how certain this number feels. Not 14 as a possibility, 14 as the fact that has been taught for nearly 2,000 years. The fact that has shaped how you imagine the most significant moment in Christian theology. 14. Not 12, not 16, not any other number that might reasonably fit the evidence. 14. Now hold that number in your head, because I need to tell you something that the scholarship has been sitting on for centuries, and the reason it has been sitting on it is not because it is unclear, but because it is clarifying in ways that institutions have found very difficult to manage. The age of Mary was not a historical puzzle. It was a historical choice, a choice that has been quietly suppressed from public understanding for nearly 2,000 years. And Spinoza traced exactly how that choice became doctrine, and why the Church needed it to be younger than the evidence could support. What you were taught as fact is built on a source that came 150 years after the person in question was dead. And once you see how that happened, you cannot unsee it. Let me show you the mechanism. The Canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, do not specify Mary's age. The text is silent. Matthew tells you she was a virgin and that she bore a son. Luke gives you more narrative detail, the angelic announcement, the dialogue with her, the perplexity of how such a thing could come about. But nowhere in either of them, nowhere in any of the four Gospels that became foundational to Christian doctrine, does anyone write down a number. Not 14, not 12, not any age at all. That silence, that absence, should have been a signal. An honest reading of the text should have produced a statement. We do not know. We cannot know. The Gospels do not tell us. That is what the evidence says, and that is not an interpretation. That is what is written and what is not written. And in scriptural interpretation, the distinction between the two should matter tremendously. But silence in theological tradition does not stay silent for long. The vacuum gets filled, and the filling comes from somewhere else entirely. There is a document called the Protevangelium of James. It is dated to the 2nd century, perhaps 150 years after the Gospels were written. Some scholars push it earlier to the late 1st century, but even the earliest estimates place it at least generations removed from the events it describes. It is what scholars call apocryphal, which is a scholarly way of saying it was not accepted into the canonical New Testament because it was written too late and by someone too distant from the events to have any claim on eyewitness authority. And yet this document, this secondary source, this late composition, became the source of the age that defined Mary in Christian imagination for 2,000 years. The Protevangelium suggests that Mary was 12 years old at her betrothal. 12. Not 14, but that is not the point I want you to focus on initially. The point is this: a document written 150 years after the events, authored by someone with no claim to intimate knowledge, written in a theological context far removed from anything Mary would have experienced, became the source that the Church Fathers cited and repeated and institutionalized, until what was a tentative suggestion in a late apocryphal text became established fact in doctrine. And here is where I need you to notice something that most scholars will not state plainly. The tradition had a choice. When the Protevangelium was circulating, and it was circulating, it was read, it was known, there were other sources available. There was Jewish testimony, preserved in the Talmudic literature and in the demographic records embedded in rabbinic discussion. There was testimony from Jewish communities who had lived in Palestine, who understood the marriage practices of the time, who had different sources entirely. The Church Fathers did not lack alternatives. They selected one. And the selection reveals something that most scholars have decided, in the privacy of their own research, to leave unsaid. I am not going to leave it unsaid. That is how it works over and over in the construction of religious authority. You take a source, you repeat it, you cite it, You defend it against alternatives. You build a theological structure on top of it. You write the alternatives out of the canon, and after a few centuries no one remembers that it was ever a choice, a suggestion, a filling of a vacuum, rather than a recovery of a fact. It becomes simply what is known. It becomes what everyone was taught. It becomes the truth that feels like it has always been obvious. I remember the first time I read the Protevangelium properly, not a summary of it, not a reference to it in another scholar's footnote, but the document itself, worked through page by page. I was in the old reading room at the Bodleian in Oxford, sometime in the middle of the 90s, working on a much broader project about early Christian sources that had been excluded from the canon. The document had been requested from the library's restricted holdings, and when the librarian brought it out and I began to work through the pages, the sensation I had was not what I had anticipated. What I had expected was antiquity, weight, some quality of first-hand proximity to the events it claimed to describe. What I encountered instead was a document that read, in every line, like someone doing their best to fill in gaps that the earlier Gospels had deliberately left empty. The writing had the texture of a secondary source trying to present itself as a primary one. The invented details accumulated, the names of Mary's parents, the narrative of her childhood in the temple, the scene of her betrothal, acquiring that particular quality that stories develop as they travel. Each retelling adds another layer of concrete particulars, until what began as a theological proposition has acquired the appearance of eyewitness testimony. I remember sitting back in that chair and looking up at the ceiling above the reading room, listening to the quiet of the space around me, and thinking something I have not quite been able to set aside since. The foundation is here, not in the Gospels. Here, in a document that reads like what it is, a composition written well after the fact, by someone who had access to theological motivation, but not historical memory. The institution needed details the Gospels did not provide. The Protevangelium provided them, and no one who built their theological edifice on those details paused to ask whether the builder had any more authority than the institution that needed the building. But here is where the Jewish evidence contradicts the entire structure so thoroughly that the contradiction cannot be ignored once it is seen. The Talmud Yevamot, one of the foundational texts of Rabbinic Judaism, provides a detailed legal analysis of marriage practices, puberty, and the age of consent in Jewish law at precisely the time when Mary would have lived, in precisely the place where she would have lived. And what it describes is not what the nativity narrative requires. What it describes is not compatible with the age the Church had established as doctrine. According to the Talmud, a ketana, a girl under the authority of her father, is defined as a girl between 3 and 12 years old. This is the period of childhood under paternal authority, before the transition to adulthood. Puberty, according to rabbinic definition and observation, typically occurred around age 12 for girls and 13 for boys, and this was understood to be the point at which a person moved from childhood into what we would call adolescence, with all the legal and social implications that followed. The appearance of signs of physical maturation, and the Talmud is quite specific about what those signs are, marked the transition. But here is what matters for this conversation. Puberty and marriageability are not the same thing. A girl might be technically of the age to marry under Jewish law, but that did not mean she married at that age. The legal permission and the social practice diverged significantly. The law permitted it. The practice did not require it. And when you look at what the sources actually describe about marriage in Jewish society, the gap between what was legally possible and what was socially ordinary becomes very clear. Jewish demographic studies, drawn from rabbinic sources and analyzed by scholars of Second Temple Judaism, scholars like Bart Ehrman, who has spent his career on exactly these questions, show something consistent across multiple independent sources. Men in Palestine during this period typically married in their late 20s or early 30s. The pattern is not from one source, it is from many sources, analyzed independently, all pointing to the same conclusion. Men married late, they had resources to secure, they had positions to establish, they had households to create. They married when they were mature, when they had the social standing and the economic capacity to maintain a wife and begin producing heirs. And the women they married? The women were post-puberty, yes, but they were also older than 14. They were in their late teens or early 20s, the age range that made sense in the context of Jewish society. If Mary had been married at 14, as the tradition claims, she would have been an outlier in Jewish society, not because marriage at 14 was shocking or impossible, but because it would have been socially unusual without extraordinary circumstances. A man of marrying age in that period would have been 25 at minimum, more typically 30 or older. There is no evidence in the sources of men routinely marrying girls barely past childhood. That is not what the demographic evidence shows. The actual practice, drawn from multiple sources, suggests something else. Women in Palestine married post-puberty, yes, but typically in their late teens or early 20s. Not 12, not 14. The years between adolescence and marriage were not filled with idle waiting. They were filled with developing into the person a marriage partnership would require, with understanding household management, with the rhythms of domestic life, with maturation into the capacity to bear children safely, because a woman bearing children at 14 is a woman at significant medical risk. The Talmud itself acknowledges this, though not in those explicit terms. The discussions of marriage, of procreation, of women's roles in the household all assume women who are fully mature. There is no category of young bride as a separate case. There is simply the married woman, assumed to be an adult. And yet the Church, reading the sources available to it, chose to fix on a number that the sources did not support and that contradicted the evidence from Jewish society itself. I need to tell you something personal here, and it is about a moment that happened some years after I had encountered the Talmudic evidence, but before I had fully understood why the tradition had fixed on such a young age. I had not yet grasped the institutional logic that required this particular fiction. I was working at that time on something unrelated, a paper on theological anthropology, the question of how institutions shape ideas about the human person, particularly the female person, as it relates to ideas about purity and submission and the body. And I had a conversation in the corridor between sessions at a conference in the north of England with a colleague I had known for some years. She was a historian, someone who had spent most of her career studying the history of women and reproduction in the ancient world, in the medieval world, in the transition between them. She had published work on childbirth, on maternal mortality, on the social construction of motherhood in different historical contexts. We were between sessions and I mentioned almost casually what the Jewish sources actually indicated about marriage practices and age. I was trying to work through my own thoughts aloud, testing them against her knowledge. And she looked at me for a moment with an expression I've never quite been able to describe. It was something like recognition of a problem she had already solved. And then she said something I have not quite been able to set down since. She said, "Of course she wasn't 14. Women in Palestine rarely had children before their 20s. The institution could not afford for you to know that. Because once you know that, you cannot help but notice what the young age was doing theologically. And you certainly cannot help but notice what it means about the institution's interest in keeping women young." And then she continued to the next session, and I stood in that corridor for rather longer than seemed professional. The coffee I had been holding had gone cold. My notes from the previous lecture were still in my hand. And what she had said in the most matter-of-fact way, as if it were obvious, as if the problem was not even interesting because the answer was so clear, had fundamentally altered what I could not help but see when I looked at the nativity narrative again. What she meant, though she did not elaborate and I did not press her to, is something that Spinoza would have recognized immediately. The fixing of Mary's age on a number so young that it became implausible, even in the context of the time, was not an accident. It was a construction. And like all constructions, it served a purpose. It was not a discovery, it was a creation. And it was created because the institution needed Mary to be a certain kind of person in order for the theological narrative to function as the institution required it to function. Let me show you what Spinoza found in that construction, what analysis reveals about the institutional logic underneath the narrative. Spinoza, working from the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, had a method for identifying what he called the institutional motives behind textual claims. His method was simple, even austere in its simplicity. Follow the narrative backwards. Ask not what the text claims, but what the claim requires the reader to believe. Ask what beliefs are necessary for the claim to make sense. Ask what psychological and theological states must be in place for the audience to accept the narrative as told. And then ask the hard question. Does the institution have an interest in the reader believing those things? Does the institution benefit from that particular set of beliefs? Applied to the age of Mary, the method produces something so stark that once you see it, the entire theological structure around the Nativity becomes transparent in ways that are difficult to describe without sounding like you are making accusations. But I am not making accusations, I am describing what the analysis reveals. If Mary was very young, younger than was plausible even by the standards of her own society, then her role in the events of the Nativity becomes narrowly constrained. She becomes, very specifically, a vessel of purity, a body untouched by anything but the divine. A woman who has not yet moved into the complexity of adulthood, of choice, of agency, of autonomy. A woman who, in her extreme youth and extreme innocence, becomes the perfect container for the theological idea of virginity as a primary virtue. She does not choose virginity. She simply is virginal by virtue of her age, by virtue of her immaturity. An older Mary, a Mary of the ages indicated in the Jewish sources, late teens or 20s, would have been a woman approaching, or at the full complexity of human personhood. She would have had years of self-determination. She would have made choices about her life, about her body, about her future. She would have developed the capacity to understand what was being asked of her. The idea of virginity would have meant something more active in her case, not the natural state of childhood, but a chosen condition, a path taken rather than a state of being. That distinction would have changed everything about how the nativity narrative functioned. It would have required asking uncomfortable questions about Mary as a person making a choice, as someone with agency, as someone whose consent to the events of the Incarnation was not simply the passive acceptance of a confused adolescent, as someone who could say yes with understanding or no with consequence. And the institution, the church, could not have that conversation, because to have it would be to acknowledge that virginity was a thing Mary did, not simply a thing Mary was. It would mean recognizing her as an agent rather than as a vessel. The young age served the theology. The young age made her pure not through choice but through immaturity. The young age made her pliable, undeveloped, incapable of the kind of autonomy that would complicate the narrative of divine dominion and female receptivity. The young age made her small enough to fit inside the theological categories the institution needed her to fit into. A young Mary could be preserved in perpetual innocence. An older Mary would have to be acknowledged as knowing what she was doing, and that acknowledgement carries implications the church could not manage. And because no one questioned the source, the Protevangelium of James, a document that no one alive in the 4th century or the 5th century or any century thereafter had any reason to trust as historical testimony, the church was able to maintain a narrative about Mary that had more to do with institutional requirements for female existence than with any evidence from the historical record. The silence of the Gospels was filled not with history, but with theology, and theology that served institutional interests very specifically. I say that carefully because I do not want to overstate the case or sound like I am making accusations that go beyond what the analysis reveals. But I also do not want to understate what Spinoza was pointing to when he analyzed this kind of construction. This is not a marginal point. This is the mechanism by which institutions shape the very idea of what it is to be human, what it is to be female, what it is to be pure or good or worthy. The young age of Mary was not a discovered fact. It was a chosen fact. It was a narrative construction that served institutional purposes, and the reason it was chosen was not because it was more likely, not because it was more historically plausible, not because the sources supported it. It was chosen because it served a purpose. It shaped how women would understand themselves. It shaped what the institution could do with the idea of women. It shaped what was possible to believe about female consent, female agency, female choice. Once you see how the age was chosen for theological convenience, you cannot help but begin to notice the other ways institutions choose their narratives, construct their facts, defend their constructions, and then teach those constructions as if they were discovered truths handed down unchanged from the beginning. It is a pattern, and Spinoza understood it better than anyone who came before him. What we can actually say about Mary's age from the evidence is this: she was not a child. She was young, yes, perhaps 20, perhaps in her late teens, somewhere in that range that fits with Jewish marriage practice and demographic reality. She was old enough to be treated as a legal adult in Jewish society, old enough to make binding agreements, old enough to be taken seriously by the society around her, old enough to understand what was being asked of her. But she was not the girl you were taught to imagine. She was not a child who did not understand what was happening to her, who could not have prevented it, who was used rather than chosen. She was a woman making a choice in circumstances that were extraordinary, certainly, but not robbed of all her personhood by the fact that she was young. And that difference matters. It matters because the young age served the institution. It matters because a woman treated as a full person, with agency and the capacity to understand what was being asked of her, complicates the narrative of divine dominion and absolute female receptivity. It matters because once you see how the age was chosen for theological convenience, you cannot help but begin to notice the other ways institutions choose their narratives, construct their facts, and then teach those constructions as if they were discovered truths. It is a pattern you see everywhere once you begin to look. The question, in the end, is not really about Mary. It is about authority. It is about whether you trust the sources that have been selected for you, or whether you learn to ask the question I asked you at the beginning. What were you taught? And where did the teaching actually come from? And perhaps more importantly, who benefits if you continue to believe it? You see, the tragic thing, or perhaps the clarifying thing, is that this is not unique to Mary. This is the pattern. The Protevangelium of James is not the only late source that the Church Fathers selected and then institutionalized despite better evidence. It is simply the most intimate example. It shapes how half of humanity understands itself. It shapes what women are permitted to be, even now, 2,000 years later. A young Mary means an obedient Mary, an innocent Mary, a Mary who is acted upon rather than acting, a Mary who is the template for what women should be, an older Mary, a Mary who made a choice, who understood what was being asked of her, who said yes to circumstances that terrified her because she grasped their meaning, that Mary is dangerous, that Mary complicates things, that Mary has agency. And the institution has always preferred its versions of women to be simpler than that. Hold that question. Hold both versions of Mary in your mind at the same time. The girl you were taught to imagine, and the woman the evidence suggests she actually was. They cannot both be true. And once you realize that, once you begin to ask which one served institutional purposes and which one was closer to the historical reality, everything else becomes harder to see in the same way. The path of following where the answers lead is not one that institutions prefer you to walk, but it is a path worth walking, even when it is uncomfortable. Especially then, take care of yourselves.
These videos take months of research. Most people who watch aren't subscribed. If this meant something to you, help me keep going. One click, that's all I'm asking.